Hi, I'm Kelsey from Just Sew, and today I'm going to show you how to make continuous bias binding. This is bias tape using one continuous strip. If you've ever tried to make bias tape before and you didn't know this method, then you probably think making bias tape is a huge waste of fabric because you're cutting all of these strips at a 45-degree angle and then sewing them together and you have all of this scrap left over. And so today I'm going to show you a method where you don't have any of that. You need minimal fabric, you have no leftovers, and you sew all of your strips together at the same time. So this project is featuring my new laptop cover pattern, which is coming out November 21st. This is just a very quick and easy quilted laptop cover pattern that I designed, but I really wanted a curved flap right here. And so I decided to use bias binding instead of regular binding so that it curved along this edge very easily with no puckers or anything. I've tried to do very gentle curves with regular bias tape before, and this was my outcome. And this is even with hand stitching, it's not with machine stitching, and you just can't get it to lay flat. And so with continuous bias binding here, I got it to curve all the way around here with no puckers or anything, and I could attach it by machine. And so that's what I'm going to show you guys how to do today. To start off, you're just going to need a square of fabric. My square is 18 by 18 inches. I could get this out of a fat quarter. Your square could be smaller or larger. If you need a lot of bias tape, then you could make a square out of the entire width of your fabric, which would probably be around 42 to 45 inches once you cut off the selvage. So depending on how much bias tape you need, you'll just need a square of fabric. An 18-inch square gives you about 4 yards of bias tape if you're cutting it at 2 1/4 inches. It also depends on how wide you're cutting your bias tape. So for my laptop cover, because it's a smaller project and I just didn't want it to be too thick, I did cut it at 2 1/4 inches. If you're making quilt binding, you might want 2 1/2, or maybe 2 1/4 is good for you. Whatever you want. The skinnier your strips, the more binding you'll obviously get out of it. But we're gonna start off with a strip like this and take it over to our cutting mat. Okay, so lay out your square on your cutting mat, and what you want to do is cut this at a 45-degree angle. Right now I only have a small ruler with me. I can still do it with this, but I'm going to mark it with a friction pen before I cut just because I'm using a smaller ruler. But typically your ruler should have a 45-degree marking on it. And so what you're just going to do is you will, make sure you can see the bottom of my fabric. You'll line it up with a straight line, and then you'll take your 45-degree angle marking and line that up with the bottom edge of your fabric so that the corner of your ruler is in the corner of your fabric and your 45-degree angle is along there as well. Then I'll just mark this, and then I will do it from the other side. And then for something like this, I'll just join my 2 lines in the middle here. But if you have a bigger ruler, then this will be a lot easier for you. Okay, so now I'm just going to cut on this line so that I have 2 triangles. All right, once you have these 2 triangles, what you're going to do is you're going to take one of them and fold it on top of the other so that the straight grain is together and your bias creates an X right here. And you're going to sew this side together with a 1/4 inch seam. Okay, once you've done that and ironed your seam open, you should have a parallelogram like this, where this is the straight grain and this is the bias. So now, before we sew these 2 angled sides together, we have to make our cutting marks. It's easier to do this when it's flat than when we're going to make a tube out of this. So we want to make our cutting marks now. So this is where it'll vary depending on the width of binding that you are making. If you're making the 2 1/4 inch like I was, then you'll just line up your ruler and you'll make your markings. And I am using a friction pen for this, but I actually am going to switch to a regular pen because you either want a regular pen or a water-soluble pen, not an iron-off pen, because you will be ironing this seam. And if you do that after you've drawn your lines, it'll get rid of your lines. I learned that the hard way. So you can either make markings with a regular pen or a water-soluble instead of an iron-off. And you'll just make lines as straight as you can. And you just use the line that you just drew as your straight edge. Once you've drawn all of your lines, depending on how thick you are drawing your lines, then you might have a leftover piece at the end like I do here that's more like an inch wide, and it's not an inch to inch and a half wide, and I'm not going to be able to use it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to cut that off right now. Okay, so now we're going to make the tube out of this, and the way that we want our tube to go is we want our angled sides to come together. So here's my one angled side and my other one, and they're going to come together like this, but they're not going to come together edge to edge. You are going to leave a little bit of leftover, and so what that looks like, your first line here is actually going to line up with your edge right here, but at the 1/4 inch mark. So if you can actually mark this, if you want to be precise, you do not have to, but if you were going to mark this line at a 1/4 inch the way down right here, oh, I got some on my finger, then that is where you want this to intersect, basically, because you're going to be sewing across here at a 1/4 inch, and that's where you want these to overlap. And you're going to do the same thing for all the following lines. You want them to overlap at about a 1/4 inch down, so that when you sew your 1/4 inch seam, they're meeting exactly. Okay, so that means that this seam should line up with this line about a 1/4 inch down if you did it right. So you'll have two triangle flaps at the ends, and you'll go ahead and sew this line 1/4 inch, and then you'll iron it open. Okay, so once you're finished, you should have something that looks like this. It's a tube, and as you can see, this means that all of your strips are sewn together, and all you have to do is start cutting on this line, and we will cut all the way around this tube until we have all of our bias tape. I've watched a couple tutorials on bias tape, and I kind of pieced a lot of them together to finally learn how to do it. But I was going to tell you, if you're finding drawing the lines and lining them up too difficult, one way that you can cut your fabric without drawing your cutting lines is to use your finger as a ruler. So if you know that 2 1/4 takes you to like right here on your finger, then you could just move your finger along and cut toward the tip of your finger and use that as your tape measure. It's totally up to you if you want to actually draw these lines or not. I found that I actually did like drawing the lines better, but then you have to line them up when you're sewing that last seam. And so it's up to you, whichever method you find easier. All right, and now you have continuous bias binding. Okay guys, I hope you found this helpful. You now have bias tape that's made along the bias, and so it is stretchy, and you'll probably, depending on what project you're using this for, you'll probably go ahead and iron it either in half, right side out with the raw edges together, or you'll iron it so that your raw edges meet in the center, and then you'll fold it around. But either way, making bias tape this way is so much easier than having your whole piece of yardage there and cutting a bunch of strips along a 45-degree angle like I used to do. So hopefully if that's what you're used to and this is your first time seeing continuous bias binding, that will take a lot off of your plate. You'll have no scraps like you saw. Besides that little 1-inch piece on the end, I had no scraps. And they are already sewn together and ready for you to use. So I hope that this was helpful for you guys. Make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel and follow me on my social links linked below. And keep an eye out for my laptop cover pattern, which will be releasing on November 21st. It'll be a PDF pattern and it's a pretty simple design, but I had a lot of fun coming up with it. I'm also going to have 2 different methods of closure. You can choose to have the buttonhole or you can choose to have a Velcro closure if you don't like making buttonholes. I actually really like making buttonholes because with my machine it's really easy, so that's why I did it. But it's totally up to you. I have 2 different instructions on how to create your closure here. And I hope that this tutorial was helpful for you as you tackle the binding on this project or whatever project you have coming up. I'll see you guys on my next video. Bye.